Hey there, YouTube. This is Alan with Think Twice MTG Pod. This is not a podcast episode, but this is something I've been thinking about trying to do and seeing how it works out and seeing how people like it. Is a deck tech video. I'm thinking that Drew and I are going to be putting out some different content coming up here alongside our podcast episodes. This is one of them where I'm just going to go through a deck, kind of explain the card choices and how it works. That way, if you want to play it, you understand a little bit how to play it. If you come up against it, you understand how to tackle it a little bit better. Another thing we're hoping to be able to do is do some gameplay videos. Where like we will record ourselves playing a match, full sideboarding just like you would in a tournament, and then I'll go back through and do some commentary and talk through the game and that sort of thing. So this is a deck tech for the deck Golgari Yawgmoth. This is a deck I picked up recently. It's really kind of piqued my interest, and I'm really enjoying it. It is a complicated deck that has lots of decisions and lots of different paths to victory and things you can do. But here it is. So first I'm just going to go over what cards are in the deck really quickly. And then there's a lot to explain with this deck in terms of like what everything does, because it is not inherently intuitive, and this deck does not play along many of the normal axes of Magic decks. Okay. So we will start with the 1-drops. Those are over here. You have 4 Delighted Halfling. It is a really powerful 1 mana creature. What it does is it taps to add a colorless, or you can tap it to add a mana of any color. It only works for legends. That's important because this deck has a lot of legendary creatures or legendary cards, and especially the main one is a legend. So what this does is the other half of that ability is if you cast a legendary spell with that colored mana ability, it can't be countered. So it allows you to force down your stuff through counter magic. So that's good. This deck plays a recently unbanned card in Green Sun Zenith. This is a tutor for a green creature. Green in an X, search your library for a green creature card with converted mana cost X or less, put it onto the battlefield, and then this gets shuffled back into your library. It does not go to the graveyard if it resolves. So a little bit weird. Most often this is searching up a land over here that is a creature. It's called Dryad Arbor. This is my build of the deck, and I play 1 Ignoble Hierarch. I've found that the deck is best when you have a 1 mana accelerant on turn 1. So by doing this package gives me 8 1 mana dorks, but I've spread them out a little bit. So the Greens and Zenith can go get Dryad Arbor on turn 1. The Delighted Halfling is the best one because of that uncounterable ability, but I wanted one more, and so I put in an Ignoble Hierarch. I feel like it's a little bit important because it does have the ability to tap for black, even for non-legendary cards, something like Orcish Bowmaster that you're going to see here, things like that. And then to round out the 1-drops, we have 3 Young Wolves. I'll explain the whole importance of Young Wolf because it's not a very powerful card on its face. We've got 3 Agatha Soul Cauldron. This card is just insane. Agatha Soul Cauldron allows you to take exile cards out of the graveyard if it's a creature. You then, all of your creatures with +1/+1 counters gain the activated abilities of those creatures that are exiled with it, which is quite a lot because a lot of things in this deck have activated abilities, and you are able to then utilize that to make your creatures be able to do a whole lot of things, which is really important. It plays 1 Blood Artist, 1 Hapatra Vizier of Poisons. I'm playing 4 Malevolent Rumble. I'll talk a little bit later about this card. 3 Orcish Bowmasters, 1 Prosperous Innkeeper, 3 Wall of Roots. 3-drops are 3 Court of Calling. They're not really a 3-drop because you're never really doing it for a 0, but the base mana cost is 3, so nice Convoke tutor spell. I've got 2 Endurances, which are important to a very complicated layer of the deck that I'll get to near the end. 3 Grist the Hunger Tide, and 4 Yawgmoth. I think it's 20 lands, I don't know, some number. 6 fetches, 2 Overgrown Tombs, 2 Underground Mortuaries is your Surveil land, 2 Blooming Marsh, 2 Beseiju, 1 Dryad Arbor, a Shifting Woodland, a Wastewood Verge, which is the new Verge card, Verge land. So you can see it's tap, add a green, and then you can also add a black if you control a forest or a swamp. not very hard to do. And then 3 basics, 2 forests, and a swamp. Sideboard, you've got 2 Fatal Push, a Thoughtseize, an Abrupt Decay, Outland Liberator, Scavenging Ooze, the 3rd Endurance, 4 Fulminator Mages. Yes, the full 4 Fulminator Mage. Might be 2015, it seems like, if you've got those. 2 Culling Ritual, and 2 Force of Vigor. Okay, so those are just the card choices that I have currently in the deck. I'm going to go through now talking about some of the important pieces. I'm going to start with the main central pieces and go into all of the differences from there, because there's a lot this deck can do. All right, so we're going to start with the central card of the deck that gives it its name, and that is Yawgmoth, Thran Physician. Yawgmoth is 2 black for a legendary human cleric that's a 2/4. Not crazy stats. You're like, hey, what is this 4-drop doing? This card is a combo enabler. Okay? It has protection from humans. That doesn't really come up very often. That's not why you're playing the deck or playing the card. The center ability, this one here, is really the one that we're looking for. Okay, so it is pay 1 life, sacrifice a creature. Those are the 2 costs. You have to do those before you get the effect. And then you can put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature, and you draw a card. That is the ability that the deck is built around. Using that and understanding that is the thing that makes the deck run. It also has an ability to pay 2 black mana and discard a card to proliferate, which is choose any number of permanents, yours or your opponent's, also players that have some amount of counters, and you can add 1 more of any of those types of counters that it has. So if it has +1/+1 counters, you add another one. If it has a poison counter, you add another one, all that sort of stuff. Once again, an ability you use sometimes, but not nearly as often as the center ability. So this is the card the deck is built around. This deck is a combo deck that is built around using that ability to sacrifice creatures, draw cards at the cost of life. And you can distribute -1/-1 counters sometimes. There's a few different things you can do with this. There are multiple cards in the deck that combo with this in a way that you can kind of use it to navigate your way through game states based on what you need. Okay, so I'm going to start with the most common thing that you need to understand the combo loops. Most of your combos revolve around, in this case, the card Young Wolf. It could be any creature with Undying. Sometimes people also will play Strangleroot Geist. I am not currently. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But Young Wolf is where we start. So Young Wolf is a single green mana for a 1/1, not super powerful, and it has 1 ability, and it's Undying. So when this dies, if it didn't have a +1/+1 counter on it, you return it to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. So that's the central idea. So the way this works is if you have Yawgmoth in play and 2 Young Wolves, you can create a chain of using these abilities over and over and over again. So the way it works is you activate Yawgmoth's ability. Let's say this is your starting point. You've got Yawgmoth and 2 Young Wolves in play exactly as they look right now. What you do is you decide to activate Yawgmoth's ability to pay a life and sacrifice a creature. The first time you don't have to put a -1/-1 counter on anything. You can, let's say your opponent has a creature, you can do that. But this is how you start what is technically an infinite loop. I say technically because it depends on your life. Okay, so you activate the ability, you declare targets if there is any for the -1/-1 counter, then you pay 1 life and sacrifice a Young Wolf. So what that will allow you to do is then the ability lets you draw a card. Young Wolf now has died without a +1/+1 counter. So what does it do? It returns to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. The reason why you want 2 Young Wolves is because now I can activate the ability a second time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to target the Young Wolf with a +1/+1 counter on it to get a -1/-1 counter, and I'm going to sacrifice the other Young Wolf. So the +1/+1 counter and the -1/-1 counter cancel each other out. That disappears. The Young Wolf that died comes back, and it has a +1/+1 counter on it. You draw a card. So what you can do is you can repeat that process and just switch the targets. So now I'm going to activate Yawgmoth again, target this young wolf with it for a -1/-1 counter, and sacrifice this one. So this one dies, I draw a card, it comes back with a +1/+1 counter, and the -1/-1 counter on this one has disappeared. So I can just bounce it back and forth, and what this results in is a loop where you pay 1 life to draw 1 card. And so based on whatever your most restricted resources, whether it's life or cards in your deck, you can do that as many times as you want. Okay? Now that in and of itself is interesting because it is a thing you can just repeatedly do and draw cards, but you have to have something you can do with it. So this is where the point where you have to start pairing other cards with this in order to create ways to win the game. The most prominent way to turn that into a game-winning combination is with the card Blood Artist. So Blood Artist is 1 and a black for a 0/1 vampire, and it says whenever this creature or another creature dies, notice that's yours or your opponent's, tricky thing to keep track of, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So the way this works is you're doing I'm going to get rid of the counter on this young wolf, sacrifice this young wolf, it'll come back with a +1/+1 counter, I've paid a life and drawn a card. That loop you can do now when you have Blood Artist in play. You've paid the life, you sack a creature. Well, a creature died. So Blood Artist sees that and says, okay, target player loses 1 life, you target your opponent, and you gain 1 life. So now you've negated the life you paid for Yawgmoth, so you're drawing cards at a neutral life, just the cost of going through the actions of looping young wolves, and you're drawing a card every time. But also then every time you're doing that, your opponent is losing a life because a creature dies. So then, as long as you have more cards in your library than your opponent has life, you can do that as many times as you need to make your opponent's life total 0. So that is a way to win the game with Blood Artist. But that's only one way to do it. There's a lot of other things you can do with this deck as well. The next card that I'm going to talk about is Prosperous Innkeeper. So Prosperous Innkeeper is 1 and a green for a 1/1 halfling citizen. When it enters, you create a treasure token, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. So similar to Blood Artist, every time you enact this loop, this time it's not triggering off of death, but every time the young wolf that died comes back with the +1/+1 counter on it, this sees that you've had a creature enter, and it gains you a life. So once again, this is another way to negate the life loss from Yawgmoth. Okay, so you can enact this loop, Yawgmoth, 2 young wolves with a Prosperous Innkeeper, in order to draw as many cards as you want at no life cost. All you're doing is just simply taking game actions to freely draw cards. That doesn't lead to a win, but it does lead you to finding whatever it is you need to win. Most often that is finding a way to dig out your Blood Artist, and then you just enact the loop, and as we've talked about before, use this ability to kill your opponent. The last card I'm going to talk about in the base combo loops is Hapatra, Vizier of Poisons. This is a card from Amonkhet. It is a black and a green for a legendary human cleric. It's a 2/2. The first ability doesn't come up much. It says whenever Hapatra, Vizier of Poisons deals combat damage to a player, you may put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. This thing isn't doing that much. It's only a 2/2. It's not getting in for combat damage very often. The second ability is the important one. So it's whenever you put 1 or more -1/-1 counters on a creature, create a 1/1 green snake creature token with Death Touch. So if you have this full loop enabled, every time you do the back and forth with a young wolf, you are going to also create an additional snake. So you're making yourself a large board of as many snakes as you drew cards. Obviously, pairing this with other creatures we've already talked about, the Prosperous Innkeeper or the Blood Artist, you're now doing that at the benefit of, well, okay, either I'm just killing my opponent so it didn't matter, or if you have Prosperous Innkeeper in, I'm now building a massive board while drawing cards and keeping my life total the same. But Hapatra is cool because it works without both young wolves in play. So let's say you only have 1 young wolf and you have Yawgmoth, Young Wolf, Hapatra, Vizier of Poisons. What you can do then is you can start the loop with only one of these. So let's say I'm going to activate Yawgmoth's ability. I'm going to put a -1/-1 counter on something. Best case scenario in this case is you have an opponent that has a creature, so you're just going to target their creature and shrink their creature a little to start this loop. You can also target Hapatra for the -1/-1 counter or the Yawgmoth if you want. Doesn't matter, as long as you have something you can put the neg counter on, this will work. So I activate Yawgmoth's ability. Let's say in this case I'm going to put the -1/-1 counter on Hapatra. Then I sacrifice the Young Wolf. As we've already said before, I'm going to draw a card. The Young Wolf is going to come back with a +1/+1 counter. Then Hapatra sees that a -1/-1 counter is put on something. My opponent's creature, my own Hapatra, whatever. Doesn't matter. So it's going to create the snake token. What I can now do is every time I can say, okay, I'm going to activate Yawgmoth's ability, put a -1/-1 counter on my Young Wolf, sacrifice the snake. So then this thing disappears. Hapatra sees that I've put a -1/-1 counter on something. The snake comes back. I do it again. Activate this, put a -1/-1 counter here, sacrifice the snake. This time, the Young Wolf will die because it is a 0/0 creature, because it's a 1/1 with a -1/-1 counter on it. So it's going to die. Hapatra will see that a -1/-1 counter is put on something, brings the snake back. Young Wolf comes back with a +1/+1 counter. So once again, pair that with your Blood Artist, and you can do that loop over and over again. Now, life neutral and dealing a damage to my opponent. Or with the Prosperous Innkeeper, I can do that to just draw as many cards as I want without losing any life overall. Well, actually, and actually in this loop with Prosperous Innkeeper, every other time you're actually going to be gaining a life, because whenever the Young Wolf dies and comes back, you get life from the snake, which offsets the cost of Yawgmoth, but you also gain an additional life from the Young Wolf. So you can do that, and every 2 activations of the Yawgmoth ability, you're actually netting 1 life, so your life total is actually increasing. Okay, but there's something else you can do that is really cool with Hapatra, and it doesn't involve anything other than these 2 creatures. Okay, so this is where you can actually play this deck kind of like a control deck, because what you're able to do, as long as you have any creature you're willing to sacrifice, okay, in this case I'm just going to have my Ignoble Hierarch out. So let's say my opponent has a board full of some number of creatures. Maybe it's Boros Energy and they've got, Ocelot Pride, a couple of tokens, and a Guide of Souls. What I can do is with Yawgmoth and Hapatra, and anything I'm willing to sacrifice to start, is I can destroy my opponent's entire board as long as I'm willing to pay the life equal to my whatever toughness my opponent has. Okay, so here's the example. What happens is I have these cards in play. I'm going to activate Yawgmoth's ability. I'm going to target one of my opponent's creatures to get to the -1/-1 counter. And I'm going to sacrifice anything that's not Yawgmoth or Hapatra to start the loop. So I sacrifice this. I put a -1/-1 counter on my opponent's creature. I draw a card. Hapatra sees the -1/-1 counter. I make a snake. Now, activate Yawgmoth's ability, target my opponent's creature for the counter, sacrifice the snake. Draw a card, pay to life, shrunk my opponent's creature. Sees the counter, snake comes back. So you can do that over and over and over again, as long as you're willing to pay the life equal to your opponent's creature's toughness to kill it. So if they have a 2/2, you do it 2 times, you've killed your opponent's creature, you paid 2 life, you drew 2 cards. Not a terrible exchange, and you can do that as many times as you want, as long as you have the life and the cards. Now, once again, when we pair it with some of our other pieces we've already talked about, let's say you have Prosperous Innkeeper in play. Now, every time you're doing this, you're shooting down your opponent's board with starting the loop here, making a snake, sacrifice it to put a counter on your opponent's creature, and you just do it over and over again, okay? Now, but with the Prosperous Innkeeper, every time the snake comes in, you gain the life back, like we've already talked about. And now you can distribute counters across your opponent's entire board as many times as you want, and you've drawn cards equal to the toughness of your opponent's board. Okay? So now Hapatra and Yawgmoth alongside one thing, you just machine gun down your opponent's entire board. And they have no creatures, you have a handful of however many cards you want, and you should be able to find a way to control and win the game from there, because at minimum you've bought yourself so much time. So those are all of the Yawgmoth loops that you're generally going to use. At the end of the video, I'll talk briefly about the endurance loops. I won't go through them in detail because it's kind of like a whole video on its own, but those are essentially the interactions you need to know in order to be like, okay, how does the deck combo? There are some other things you can do with Yawgmoth. Basically, whenever you have Yawgmoth in play, all of your creatures in play equal -1/-1 counters you can distribute to your opponent's board. So the deck can often play like a board control deck by just being like, oh, you've got an Ocelot Pride. That's annoying. I have this token sitting around. I'm going to exchange my token to kill your creature and draw a card. And so you can keep your opponent's board under control with that as long as you have Yawgmoth in play and anything else. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the other important creatures now that, or other cards that are played in the deck and how they interact with things. All right, the next set of cards that's important in the deck are what I'm calling the tutors. Two of them are actual tutors. One of them is not exactly, but it functions mostly that way in the deck. So the first one we can talk about is Green Sun Zenith. This is the recently unbanned card. It's green and X, search your library for a green creature card with mana value X or less, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle Green Sun Zenith into its owner's library. So basically you can go find any green creature in your deck for 1 additional mana beyond what it would normally cost you to play it. The most common way you're using this card is to go find a Dryad Arbor on turn 1. Okay. The next one is Chord of Calling. Chord of Calling is triple green and X, and it's going to essentially do the same thing. You're going to be able to go search your library for any creature card, no longer a green creature card, with a mana value X or less, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. This one, though, has 2 upsides. It is an instant, and it has Convoke, so you can tap your creatures to pay for the mana cost of it. So sometimes you can even use Chord of Calling if you have enough creatures on board, even if you don't have any lands untapped, so you don't have any open mana. Obviously, the downside is it costs 2 more mana than Green Sun Zenith. But the fact it's an instant, the fact that it has Convoke and it goes and gets any creature makes it very powerful in this deck because some of your key important creatures are not green, Yawgmoth specifically. The next one is Malevolent Rumble. This is a Modern Horizons 3 card. It's 1 and a green for a sorcery. Reveal the top 4 cards of your library. You may put a permanent card from among them into your hand, put the rest into your graveyard, and then you create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn that says sacrifice this creature, add a green. So these 3 cards essentially are in the deck in order to add an immense amount of consistency. Okay, so you basically are able to use these cards to find what you need in a situation. I said the most common instance for Green Sun Zenith is turn 1, you play it, you go get Dryad Arbor. Now you've essentially played a 1 mana dork. Okay, but Green Sun Zenith can also get Prosperous Innkeeper that we've talked about. It can get a Delighted Halfling. It can get Hapatra Vizier of Poisons. It can get Wall of Roots. Ignoble Hierarch. It can grab Young Wolf. It can grab Grist the Hunger Tide. Grist has a cool bit of ability. Its static ability says as long as it's not on the battlefield, it's a 1/1 green insect creature. So these creature tutors can go get your Planeswalker, which is either going to spit out a bunch of small bugs, or you can use it as removal, which is really important. Okay, you can also go grab Endurance with Green Sun Zenith. Okay, so what Green Sun Zenith has done for the deck is it has done 2 things. It is now you're more likely to have a mana creature on turn 1, or at least just as likely, but now you don't have to play the full 8 mana creatures. I don't have to play Delighted Halfling as a 4 of and Ignoble Hierarch, because sometimes those aren't going to be good draws. So it's made your later game draws better, because what is my mana dork turn 1 turns into any of these other things. Oh, I need my Prosperous Innkeeper so I can go and loop and then just draw my whole deck if I want to. I can go get that. Oh, I need Hapatra and then I can shoot down my opponent's entire board. Let's do that. I just need a Young Wolf to get the loop started. You see where it's going. It allows you just to go get all kinds of cards. Chord of Calling is similar, except for the fact that you get to add in the non-green creatures, Orcish Bowmaster, Blood Artist. Remember, Blood Artist is our main win condition once we've assembled the combo. And obviously the piece that needs the most is Yawgmoth. Chord is also really nice because you can hold it up at instant speed and either wait for your opponent to put the shields down and tap out. Maybe they're like, oh, I need to get my threat in place, so I'm going to spend my mana and put this in play. And you go, okay, we're in response. Or at the end of your turn, then I'm going to go get the thing that I need and then untap, and you've basically taken multiple actions in a row without your opponent being able to. Or it's optionality. You're like, well, maybe I need to make sure I stop my opponent from doing something. And I don't know, are they going to enact a graveyard threat or try to like reanimate something? Well, then I can go and search up my endurance. Or I can go get, Hapatra if I have Yawgmoth in play, and so I can do the whole take out your board. It just gives you the optionality to be able to go pick anything in the deck at the moment you need it. Or like I said, the most common way is then you pass, you have all this mana up, make your opponent think about, hey, what the heck am I going to go get? And then you like kind of take advantage of their play, because if they don't do anything, you don't have to act, that sort of thing. Rumble is not the same as a tutor, but I put it in this category because essentially it is a 2-mana card that looks at 4 and you get to take the best one. So it's essentially an impulse, but it's an impulse that gives you back a mana because it makes an Eldrazi spawn token. So it makes this Eldrazi spawn token which says sacrifice a creature, add a colorless mana. So it gives you a rebate. So then you got to impulse for 1 mana. Super good. Because you can then sacrifice this and use it for mana to keep going. But also now you just have another creature that you can sacrifice to Yawgmoth, which sometimes that's just what you need, is a bunch of dumb bodies. Because you have a lot of situations where you have Yawgmoth in play, but maybe you don't have any of your Blood Artist, Hapatra, Prosperous Innkeeper, or you just don't have multiple Young Wolves. So what you're able to do then is, without these key cards in play, but let's just say you have an Eldrazi spawn and some mana creatures floating around, or even Bowmaster and its token, you can sacrifice all of these to draw a card and make your opponent's board smaller, just dig deep, because a lot of times, like your mana creatures, once you've gotten a couple turns in, you've got mana. So you don't need these to create mana anymore, and so now they're useful in that it's just a body you can sack that you didn't invest a ton in, but it gets you a card back, and it might also help you keep the game under control by shrinking your opponent's board. So Rumble, creating this body, I think is really important. There is a new card that many people are excited about to try, and I'm going to talk about that just for a brief second. I haven't tried it out myself yet, though, so this is all theory. So the card is Dredger's Insight. So this card is very similar to Malevolent Rumble. It's the same cost, casted at the same speed. Instead of being a sorcery, this one's an enchantment, so it's a permanent. And the second ability is, when this enchantment enters, mill 4 cards, you may put an artifact, creature, or land card from among the milled cards into your hand. Now, notably, this might not be able to get certain things. I don't know if there's anything right now in the deck that it can't get, because the one thing that comes to mind is, oh, it can't get my Planeswalker Grist. Grist is cool because it functions as a creature in another place. You couldn't pick up another copy of this, so it doesn't have that added benefit. Neither of the cards can get any of the tutors that are out. It can't get greens, and it can't get Chord of Calling. But so, really, you're not losing out on the ability to get anything. But it doesn't give you the Eldrazi spawn. This one, though, the reason people are thinking that maybe it's worth inclusion, maybe even instead of Malevolent Rumble, is that it has the line, whenever one or more artifacts and or creature cards leave your graveyard, you gain 1 life. So when you're in the position of looping Young Wolves with Yawgmoth, every time that creature comes back from undying, you've gained the life, which succeeds in doing the same effect as your Prosperous Innkeeper at gaining yourself the life that you spent back. Where I am skeptical of this card is this Eldrazi spawn. The spawn has proven to be very useful. It lets you go and get a lot of things, or like keep the chain going, because it makes your card only cost 1 mana, and having the body is really important. The Dredger's Insight builds of Yawgmoth have to run more Undying creatures, which means you're often running the full 4 Young Wolves, and you're running Strangleroot Geist, and I'm not sure that that is the optimal build. Now, I haven't tried it, so that is just my theory. What I'm planning to do is take out 1 Malevolent Rumble, put in 1 Dredger's Insight, and see how it happens. The next 2 cards I'm going to briefly touch on are some of the other 2 drops, Wall of Roots, Orcish Bowmasters. Orcish Bowmasters doesn't need a lot of explanation, because if you know the card, you know what it does, and it does just that thing. It is a flash threat, it pings for a damage and makes a second body in Orc army. And so having in the deck a lot of times just because, like, hey, you want that. It's a good interactive creature. It also makes 2 bodies for you to sacrifice to Yawgmoth, which can be really important when you don't have the full loop assembled. So you can dig. It's just good like that. There's one other interaction with this card that I think is really good. We'll get when we talk about the next card. Okay. The other creature here is Wall of Roots. It is essentially a mana dork, but can add mana once per turn at the cost of putting a -0, -1 counter on Wall of Roots, and every time you can do that once per turn to add green mana. So this is cool because it can give you mana twice in a turn cycle. You can play it. Unlike other mana dorks, you don't have to wait for it to not have Summoning Sickness to tap it. So you can play it on turn 2, immediately put the counter on it, and play a green 1-drop. So it kind of accelerates that way. I think it pairs well with Malevolent Rumble and the Spawn token, because these are both 1-drops, or 2-drops, that function as a 1-drop because they give you a mana back right away. And so it's really nice that a lot of your 2-drops function as 1-mana cards because they give you the rebate right away. Wall of Roots is cool because it also counts as 2 mana for Court of Calling, because you can put the counter on it and then tap it for Convoke. So it allows you to be able to more consistently Court of Calling for higher values, because it gives you that mana, and you can use its ability on your turn, say play a 1-drop creature, and then go to your opponent's turn and use the ability again to Convoke and tap both creatures. And so then your Wall of Roots is representing 3 mana on Court of Calling, which is important because now you've covered the base cost of the green, green, green. So as long as you have, I don't know, depending on what you want to go get, 1, 2, 3, or 4 other ways to either tap a creature or tap mana, you can go get whatever you want, and it doesn't cost you nearly as much as it normally might. All right, one of the last cards we need to talk about is Agatha's Soul Cauldron. So this card does a whole lot of stuff. There are 3 big lines of text here. So it's a 2-mana artifact. It is a legend. It's important because then you can make it uncounterable with Delighted Halfling. And it says you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to activate abilities of creatures you control. So Yawgmoth ability, for instance, that is black, black, which can be kind of hard to pull off sometimes because you are a heavy green deck. You can now spend any mana. It doesn't matter if it's colorless, green, black, whatever. So it just makes activating some of those abilities of creatures a little bit easier. It also has creatures you control +1/+1 counters on them have all activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. So it is going to allow your creatures to have abilities of things they are not. And so then the final ability is tap, exile a card from a graveyard. So just, there you go. That on its own is, all right, sweet. It's kind of some graveyard hate, and I'm able to stop my opponent from doing graveyard shenanigans. But you can also do it to yourself, which is really important in this deck, because when a creature card is exiled that way, so when you exile a creature card like a Soul Cauldron, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, which lets you now utilize the second ability of now all of my creatures with the +1/+1 counter. This kind of enables that. have all of the activated abilities of the creatures exiled with it. So in this deck, you are actually often using Agatha's Soul Cauldron to exile your own cards from your graveyard, because you can, say for instance, give any creature that has a +1/+1 counter on it the abilities of Yawgmoth. You could put a mana creature underneath it. Ignoble Hierarch, Delighted Halfling, Dryad Arbor. Those will all then make any creature you have with a +1/+1 counter on it be able to use their mana abilities, including the one from Delighted Halfling of it can't be countered if it's a legend. You can also say, hey, here's a different mana creature, Wall of Roots. I can now use the -0, -1 counter on Wall of Roots, so they can all spit out even more mana, even if they can't tap yet. Or the big kicker is you can put a Grist underneath this thing, because remember, Grist has that static ability of anywhere except for the battlefield, it is a creature. So when it's under Agatha's Soul Cauldron, it is exiled, it is a creature, and then any creature you have that has a +1/+1 counter on it has Grist's Planeswalker abilities. Very importantly, the +1. Throw it up there on the screen. The +1 ability of create a 1/1 black and green insect creature token, then mill a card. And then if an insect card is milled this way, put a loyalty counter in Grist and repeat the process. So if you mill another Grist, you get to do it twice. So thus, if you have Grist underneath Agatha's Soul Cauldron, every creature you control can use that +1 loyalty ability to spit out another creature. This works really well for two reasons. One, now you're creating a bunch of things you got for free, so you're willing to sacrifice them with Yawgmoth, or something that has Yawgmoth's ability, thanks to Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Also, what you're doing is you're now milling a card, and maybe you mill another one of these creatures that has an activated ability in order to put it under Agatha's Soul Cauldron the next turn, and now they can start to do all kinds of things. This can get really confusing in this deck playing it in paper, because you can have +1/+1 counters on creatures. You can have -0, -1 counters. You can have -1, -1 counters, and you can have loyalty counters. You can put 4 different types of counters on a creature. So I found that it's really important to have various styles of dice. I used to carry just a bunch of these purple D6s to mark anything, because if it's on a Planeswalker, clearly it's loyalty. If it's on a creature, it's a +1/+1 counter. Or even if I'm playing Persist, it's just a -1, -1 counter, remember. But now I carry a whole bunch of different styled dice in colors and styling. Some have these pips, some have numbers, in order to make it so that it's easier to be able to tell. So I can say, okay, all of the purple dice are +1/+1 counters. The green dice are loyalty counters. The ones with numbers instead of pips are -1, -1 counters, or something along those lines, in order to keep track of all of the differences, because that can be really confusing, and you want to make sure you're being as clear as possible with your board state. Okay. So you've got all this stuff you can do. There's a couple things that play nicely with this, because yes, Agatha's Soul Cauldron on its own does exactly the thing. It's going to put a +1/+1 counter on something to give it the ability of whatever you've given it, but you can make it even better because you have 2 different cards in your deck that already naturally get +1/+1 counters. Cards we've already talked about, Orcish Bowmaster and Young Wolf. When a Young Wolf comes back with Undying, it has a +1/+1 counter on it, which means you can do some really cool nonsense, especially if you have a Grist underneath your Soul Cauldron, because then you've sacrificed the Young Wolf with Yawgmoth, you've drawn a card, this comes back with a +1/+1 counter on it. Then before you do anything in any of the loops we've talked about to get rid of that counter, you put a Grist +1 ability on it, make an insect token. Now you have something else to sacrifice, maybe you've gained more life, and then you get rid of this and it comes back, and every time it comes back, it's a new permanent. So you can do that every time your Young Wolf comes back with Undying. You can activate Grist's ability. Really nuts, you make tons of stuff. The Orcish Bowmaster, kind of similar. It creates the Orc Army token when you amass. that is a +1/+1 counter. So you also have some things that naturally have +1/+1 counters, along with the counters that Agatha's Soul Cauldron distributes. You can do some insane things with this card. The deck is cool on its own. This is a good card. This is a good card. Like, it does these things. When you start putting them underneath Agatha's Soul Cauldron and all your creatures are all of these things, you go ballistic. You create tons of bugs, activate all kinds of abilities. This card is insane. And one of my biggest problems with the Dredger's Insight builds of the decks that I've seen is they're cutting this card. And this card is so powerful, and I'm not sure that's the right way to go. Once again, not an expert. I haven't tried a lot of things, but that just feels counterintuitive to what I know. All right, one of the last two things we're going to talk about here is endurance loops. So there is a thing you can do with this deck that when things are in what I found so far to be rare situations where you've assembled this combination of cards. You have Yawgmoth, you have 2 Young Wolves, and you have Prosperous Innkeeper. So you can draw cards without losing life, but you haven't found a way to win. You could technically also do it if you swapped a Young Wolf for a Hapatra, because you can do the thing with the snake token and bouncing the stuff back and forth. So either one, but you've assembled this amount of the combo, but you're like, I can't win yet. What you can do is essentially you get to this state and you have drawn your whole deck. So your whole deck is in your hands. You have no library, okay? What you're able to do is you then have 2 endurances and a Chord of Calling available to you. What you're able to do is to figure out, okay, I need something to do stuff with. And what this allows you to do, and this is going to be the short version, I'm not going to go into all the details of exactly how to pull it off. I'm just going to talk the theory, is you're able to use Yawgmoth to sacrifice something that you want to play again. Let's just say it's your Prosperous Innkeeper, because Prosperous Innkeeper makes a treasure token every time it enters, so you can create mana. You can also do this with Orcish Bowmaster, because then you can create damage, because every time it enters, you can ping your opponent for 1. What you're able to do is you get to the point where you have no library. You then are able to sacrifice the thing you want to play again with Yawgmoth. With that draw on the stack, what you do, because you have your whole deck in your hand, remember, so you've got tons of green cards available to you, is you're going to evoke 1 endurance. You're going to put the shuffle ability on the stack last, or first, so it'll resolve last, then the sacrifice for evoke. With that on the stack, you respond to yourself, you do it again, and you're going to put the evoke on the stack first, and then the shuffle. So the way they're going to resolve is a shuffle, sacrifice an endurance, and a shuffle in that order. So then with that ability on the stack, you're able to shuffle in the 1 card you just sacrificed, Chord of Calling with your creatures here, okay? Get this thing back. Put this into play, okay? Then these 2 get sacrificed. This also goes to the graveyard. Then they get shuffled in. That becomes your library. Then what you've got is you've got a tapped Yawgmoth. You then do the loop with these, so they will both end up untapped because they will both at some point come back. You draw these cards again. Then you do the same thing. Sacrifice, evoke, shuffle it in, convoke. Okay. Now you've got treasure, things like that, and you're able to start doing these loops with going and getting certain things. Okay. And so you can just loop this over and over again to eventually net mana with this, and then you can switch to, once you've netted enough mana, you can switch to getting Orcish Bowmasters, and you're able to start pinging your opponent. Okay. So it is a way to be able to do those types of loops. I found so far that they're very rare. Some people build the deck without like a Blood Artist effect in order to just be like, this is the way we win. I think it's important if you're playing the deck to understand, but so far I have not come into game situations where I've actually needed to do it, because most of the time, if you're running a Blood Artist, unless it's been exiled, you're going to be able to get to a point where, so this is once again the main setup. you can draw as many cards as you want. So let's say somebody has made you discard or you milled your Blood Art or something like that. So it's in your graveyard. Sorry, that's really hard to see with the glare. So your Blood Artist is in your graveyard. So you draw cards with the looping until you find your Chord and your Endurance. And you don't need 2 Endurances this way. What you do is you evoke 1 Endurance, shuffle these back in, Chord, because maybe you have extra creatures or whatever you need to do, and then you're able to get your Blood Artist into play, and you just do this, and you can keep on shuffling cards back in with your Endurances. And if you need to, you just go to your opponent's upkeep, because if you have your whole deck in your hand, you have to discard at your cleanup. And so you just keep 7 cards, put the rest in, now you can just draw as many things as you need to. So often, it is not something that is going to be necessary. I think it is important to understand how to do those loops, just in case you run into the situation where it's important. But you have to remember that in order to do those loops, you have to be playing 2 Endurance in your deck. So I play 2 Endurance main deck. It also happens to just be really good against anything with graveyards, because now you just have 2 Endurance and 3 Agatha's Soul Cauldron as main deck graveyard hate. Finally, we're just going to talk about the sideboard really quickly. Most of this is self-explanatory. Force of Vigor, you have a ton of green cards, so Force of Vigor is just your way to hate out things like Mox Opal or Urza Saga decks, and you can just hit 2 things for free. Pretty simple, not really anything tricky here. A lot of decks run some number of Culling Ritual. Culling Ritual is a 4-mana kind of like pseudo board wipe. You destroy each non-land permanent with a mana value 2 or less, and the first thought is, well, that's bad. You have a lot of those things yourself in your deck. But what the other line of text on this card is, add black or green mana for each permanent destroyed this way. So even if you're destroying a bunch of stuff, you then create a bunch of mana, and you can then probably play out more things. And then, so it's kind of like, oh, hey, Boros Energy opponent, I destroyed all of your little creatures. I got back mana, played out more stuff, and now I have a board and you don't. I play the full 4 Fulminator Mage. There's a lot of like Eldrazi or Tron style decks in my local meta, but I think those are also matchups that can be difficult without this, because they just do really huge things and you're not super fast. So the decks that I've noticed that I struggle against the most with this deck are ones that require you to be able to put on a clock. So decks that are built to be slower or bigger than you are like, ooh, I struggle with that. Fulminator Mage really helps, because not only is it just 3 mana, destroy your land, hey, hit your Eldrazi Temple, take out a Tron land, something like that, but also it is an activated ability. So you can put it underneath the Agatha's Soul Cauldron. All of your creatures with +1/+1 counters then become Fulminator Mages. So you're able to destroy your opponent's lands and then build your board from there with whatever you're doing. I run a 3rd Endurance just for graveyard hate. Not really for the loop consideration, but just, hey, here's another one. I'm iffy right now on the Scavenging Ooze. There are times that it's good, but I think you have other stuff, and I don't know how much you need the graveyard hate, but Scavenging Ooze is a cool card. Also has an activated ability, so then if you have +1/+1 counters on your creatures, everything becomes a Scavenging Ooze. Another one is Outland Liberator. So it is a human werewolf, and it has 1 sacrifice Outland Liberator, destroy target artifact or enchantment, and it has Daybound, which is then the mechanic you have to keep track of for the rest of the game if it's day or night, depending on how many spells the active player cast in the return, which is kind of annoying, but whatever. On the backside, it flips into a 3/3 that has the same ability, but then also whenever it attacks, you can destroy an artifact or enchantment, so you don't have to sacrifice it. But important thing is it's a tutorable artifact or enchantment destruction, which is sometimes really important for if people have hate cards in for you, whether it's something like a Pithy Needle effect to make it so you can't activate abilities, graveyard hate, whatever. But then, since it's an activated ability, you can put it underneath Agatha's Soul Cauldron, and all of your creatures can do this. Next is Abrupt Decay. Just destroys a lot of different stuff, and the key thing is this one, it can't be countered. You can destroy a Psychic Frog and just not worry about it anymore. I hit a Static Prison with it yesterday to get back my Scavenging Ooze mid-combat, just block a Guide of Souls, eat the Guide of Souls, and then I was kind of off to the races. I run 1 Thoughtseize right now. I really want to run a second one, mostly just because I know that a bunch of people's sideboards have them. Not because I necessarily think that it's exactly what you should be doing. I'm not sure which matchups I want it the most in, but probably those same ones that I want Fulminator in to take out your big thing. So Thoughtseize, I'd kind of like to find space for another one. And last, 2 Fatal Push. Just sometimes the fast down to the ground decks, you can't wait to get a Yawgmoth into play to start taking out some of their stuff. So kills Guided Souls, kills a Johnny, kills Psychic Frog, and so having a couple of those is important as well. So that is the Yawgmoth deck. Sorry this is so long. I didn't really expect it to be a 50-minute video, but apparently I ramble. So if this is something that you kind of enjoy watching or you think is useful, let me know. If you're like, hey, dude, you need to be shorter, don't go into so much depth, just do a really quick survey of what's going on, fine. Or if maybe I should do more of talking about the ways to kill stuff than just explaining what every card does, because maybe the people watching this are much more like modern aficionados and they kind of already know the cards and they know how the deck works. But hopefully you enjoy. Let us know, leave us feedback over what you think or other ideas you've got, and we will see you all next time. Thanks for watching.